Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's been keeping me up, and I mean that literally. We're exploring the people who never slept so civilization could wake up. The night shift workers of history, the ones who labored in darkness, so the rest of the world could function in daylight. You know that feeling when you're up at 3 a.m., maybe scrolling through your phone, and you hear a garbage truck rumbling down the street? There's something almost mystical about knowing that while you're cozy in bed, someone else is out there doing the work that keeps society running. Well, that feeling, that's as old as civilization itself. Tonight, we're going back to when the night shift was literally a matter of life and death. When working through the night wasn't just about making ends meet, it was about making sure there were ends to meet at all. We'll walk through the flour-dusted darkness of medieval bakeries, where men worked by candlelight to ensure their neighbors wouldn't starve. We'll creep through Tudor London's shadowy apothecary shops, where healers ground herbs and mixed potions while the rest of the city slept off their ailments. And we'll end up in colonial American taverns, where the real revolution wasn't just being planned, it was being whispered over ale at 2 in the morning. So grab your favorite blanket, maybe make some tea, and let's explore the remarkable lives of history's night owls. Because trust me, after tonight, you'll never look at your 9 to 5 the same way again. Chapter 1. The Medieval Baker's Dawn. The bread of life. Literally, picture this. It's 2 a.m. in medieval Europe, sometime around 1350. The world is black as pitch. No streetlights, no neon signs, no gentle glow from smartphone screens. Just the kind of darkness that makes you question whether you still have eyes. And in this darkness, while everyone else is dreaming of not dying from plague, there's a man stumbling through the cold toward a stone building that's about to become his personal hell. This is our medieval baker, and he's about to start his workday. Not at the crack of dawn, that's for amateurs. He's starting in what we'd call the dead of night, because bread doesn't bake itself, and an entire community is depending on him to not screw this up. The medieval baker's relationship with time was complicated. See, bread was literally the staff of life, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. For most people, bread made up about 70% of their daily calories. If the baker didn't show up, people didn't eat. If the baker overslept, the village had a problem. If the baker died, well, the village better hope his apprentice was paying attention. The workshop of wonders and horrors. Let's follow our baker into his workshop. And I use the term workshop very loosely here. This was essentially a stone cave with a massive oven that could double as a crematorium. The walls were thick stone, not for aesthetic reasons, but because anything thinner would have been a fire hazard of epic proportions. The ceiling was low, blackened with decades of smoke, and the air was thick enough to chew. The centerpiece of this operation was the oven, a massive stone beast that could reach temperatures of 800 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, that's hot enough to melt copper. Your modern oven tops out at about 500 degrees, and that's with precise temperature controls and safety features. This medieval oven was basically a controlled volcanic eruption, and our baker had to manage it with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Lighting this monster was an art form in itself. First, you had to build a fire inside the oven chamber using massive amounts of wood, not just any wood, seasoned hardwood that would burn hot and clean. The baker would pile logs inside the oven and set them ablaze, letting the fire burn for hours until the stone walls absorbed enough heat to stay hot for the entire baking process. Think of it as the world's most expensive and dangerous space heater. The temperature control was pure guesswork and experience. No thermometers, no gauges, no digital displays. The baker would test the heat by throwing flour into the oven and watching how quickly it browned. Too fast, and the bread would burn. Too slow, and it wouldn't rise properly. Getting it wrong meant a day's work wasted and a community going hungry. The alchemy of flour and fire. No, here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval bread wasn't just flour, water, and yeast. Oh no, it was a complex social document that told you everything about your place in society. The whiter your bread, the higher your status. The darker and grittier your bread, the more likely you were to be, well, literally eating dirt. The wealthy got fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour. This was the medieval equivalent of artisanal sourdough, expensive, labor-intensive, and absolutely worth bragging about. The middle class ate brown bread, which was wheat mixed with cheaper grains like rye or barley, and the poor, they got what was basically edible concrete, a mixture of whatever grains were available, often bulked up with peas, beans, or in desperate times, acorns and bark. Our baker had to manage all of these different types simultaneously. He'd start with the finest white loaves, which required the hottest oven temperature and the most careful attention. These were often destined for the local lord's table, and getting them wrong could mean losing your license to bake, or worse. As the oven temperature gradually decreased, he'd move on to the coarser breads. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and the bread wouldn't cook through too late, and it would come out sad and dense. Remember, this is all happening in the middle of the night, by candlelight, with no way to precisely measure temperature or time. The guild system, medieval, quality control. Baker didn't work alone in this system. He was part of the medieval guild system, which was basically a combination of trade union, quality control board, and social club all rolled into one. The Bakers Guild had rules about everything: how much bread could be baked, what ingredients could be used, even how much profit was acceptable. The guild enforced something called the size of bread, which was a complex pricing system that tied the cost of bread to the price of grain. If grain prices went up, bread prices could go up too, but only by a specific amount. If a baker was caught cheating, making loaves too small, using inferior ingredients, or charging too much, the punishment was swift and public. The most famous punishment was the pillory, where the dishonest baker would be locked in a wooden frame in the town square with his substandard bread hung around his neck. The townspeople were encouraged to throw things at him, usually rotten vegetables, but sometimes rocks if they were feeling particularly vindictive. It was like medieval Yelp reviews, but with actual physical consequences. The apprentice system, learning by burning. Working alongside our master baker was usually an apprentice, typically a boy between 12 and 16 years old. This kid was learning the trade the hard way by doing everything wrong until he figured out how to do it right. The apprentice's job was to help with the heavy lifting, tend the fire, and gradually learn the mysterious art of bread making. The apprentice would start his day even earlier than the master, arriving around 1 a.m. to start the fire and prepare the workspace. He'd haul water from the well, carry sacks of flour from storage, and basically do all the grunt work that kept the operation running. This was before child labor laws, obviously. So, a 14-year-old working 16-hour days in a 100-degree stone oven was just considered good character building. The learning process was brutal. Burns were common from the oven, from hot tools, from molten bread that fell off the paddle. The apprentice would learn to read the oven's temperature by the color of the flames and the sound the fire made. He'd learn to judge the doneness of bread by its color, its sound when tapped, and even its smell. The social impact. Bread as communitizer, something that might surprise you. The medieval bakery was essentially the community's wiffle. People didn't usually have ovens in their homes. They were too expensive, too dangerous, and too fuel-intensive. Instead, families would prepare their bread dough at home and bring it to the communal bakery to be baked. This created a fascinating social dynamic. The bakery became a gathering place, the source of news and gossip, and a measure of community health. If the baker was sick, the entire neighborhood felt it. If grain shipments were delayed, everyone knew about it immediately. The baker was part tradesman, part community center operator, and part crisis manager. The baker also served as an informal banker and credit system during hard times. He might extend credit to struggling families, allowing them to get bread and pay later when things improve. This wasn't altruism, it was good business. A dead customer doesn't buy bread, and a grateful customer is a loyal customer. The dangers of the trade working in a medieval bakery was genuinely dangerous. The most obvious risk was fire. These buildings were essentially wooden structures built around massive stone ovens surrounded by flammable materials like flour, straw, and wood. Bakers' fires were a constant threat to entire neighborhoods. But fire wasn't the only danger. The physical demands of the job were enormous. Bakers developed a condition called baker's knee from constantly kneeling to tend the low ovens. They suffered from chronic back problems from lifting heavy sacks of grain and massive loaves of bread. The heat and smoke led to respiratory problems, and the long hours in poor lighting often resulted in vision problems. The flour itself was a health hazard. Medieval flour was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grew on rye and could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Bakers were among the first to be affected by contaminated grain serving as unwitting canaries in the coal mine for the rest of the community. The economics of bread. Medieval baker operated in a tightly controlled economy. The price of bread was regulated by local authorities, and the profit margins were razor-thin. A baker made his money on volume, not markup. He needed to sell a lot of bread to make a living, which meant working constantly and never taking a day off. The seasonal nature of grain production added another layer of complexity. Harvest time meant cheap grain and good profits. Winter meant expensive grain and thin margins. A bad harvest could bankrupt a baker, while a good harvest could make him relatively wealthy. The baker also had to manage his relationship with the local mill. Mills were often owned by the local lord, who charged a fee for grinding grain into flour. This fee, called multure, was typically about 10% of the grain's value. The baker had to factor this cost into his pricing, along with fuel costs, labor costs, and the regulated profit margin. The rhythm of the night. Medieval baker's night had a rhythm all its own. It started around 2 a.m. with lighting the oven and preparing the workspace. By 3 a.m., the first batch of dough would be ready for kneading. The kneading process was exhausting. Medieval bakers developed incredibly strong arms and shoulders from working tough, dense dough without the benefit of mechanical mixers. By 4 a.m., the first loaves would go into the oven. The timing was critical. Bread needed to be ready when people started their day, usually around sunrise. The baker would work in batches, constantly managing the oven temperature, rotating loaves, and preparing the next batch. The work was relentless. There were no coffee breaks, no time to check social media, no quick snacks. The baker worked steadily through the night, his only light coming from the oven's glow and perhaps a few candles. The workshop would be filled with the sounds of crackling fire, the scrape of wooden paddles against stone, and the occasional curse when something went wrong. The dawn delivery. As the sun began to rise, the baker's night shift would reach its climax. The bread needed to be ready for the morning customers, which meant precise timing and perfect execution. The first customers would arrive as early as 5 a.m. Looking for fresh bread to start their day. The baker would arrange his loaves by type and quality, with the finest white bread displayed prominently and the coarser breads grouped by price. Each loaf was marked with a distinctive stamp that identified the baker, a form of medieval branding that served both as advertising and quality control. The morning rush was intense but brief. Most people bought their bread early, before heading to their own work. By 7 a.m., the bulk of the day's sales would be complete, and the baker could finally think about getting some rest. But first, he had to clean the workshop, prepare for the next night's baking, and maybe grab a quick meal. The legacy of the night shift. Medieval baker's night shift established patterns that we still see today. The idea that fresh bread should be available first thing in the morning, the social role of the baker as a community cornerstone, and the precise timing required to coordinate production with consumption, all of these concepts trace back to those medieval workshops. These bakers were the unsung heroes of their communities. They worked in darkness so others could eat in daylight. They sacrificed their sleep so others could have their daily bread. They transformed simple ingredients into the foundation of civilization itself, one loaf at a time. And here's the thing that really gets to me. They did all of this without any of the conveniences we take for granted. No electric lights, no thermostats, no timers, no safety equipment, just skill, dedication, and an understanding that the work had to be done, no matter how difficult or dangerous. So the next time you're up at 3 a.m. and you hear a delivery truck rumbling down your street, remember our medieval baker. Remember that the night shift has always been there, keeping civilization running while the rest of us sleep. And maybe, just maybe, you'll have a little more appreciation for that fresh bread waiting for you in the morning. Chapter 2. The Tudor Apothecary's Vigil. The Midnight Chemist. Let's jump forward a few centuries to Tudor England, around 1580. The world has gotten a bit brighter literally. Candles are more common, oil lamps are improving, and there's even some early experimentation with coal for lighting. But make no mistake, the night is still dark and full of terrors. Especially if you're sick. Enter the Tudor apothecary, history's most unlikely combination of chemist, therapist, and midnight emergency room, while physicians were busy bleeding patients and consulting the stars. Apothecaries were the ones actually trying to cure people, and they did most of their best work after dark, when the rest of the world was asleep, and they could focus on the delicate art of not accidentally poisoning their customers. Our apothecary, let's call him Thomas Whitmore, is hunched over wooden workbench in a shop that smells like a combination of a spice market and a cemetery. The scent is complex. Sweet herbs mingle with bitter roots, while the underlying smell of various animal parts adds a distinctly medieval flavor to the air. It's like walking into a health food store that's been invaded by a taxidermist. The workshop of wonders and horrors. Tudor apothecary shop was a fascinating place, part laboratory, part library, and part museum of the bizarre. The walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of ceramic jars, each labeled with cryptic Latin names that would make a modern pharmacist weep with confusion. These jars contained everything from common herbs like rosemary and thyme to more exotic ingredients like powdered unicorn horn. Spoiler alert, it wasn't actually from unicorns and bezoar stones, which were actual stones, but from the stomachs of goats. The centerpiece of the shop was the workbench, which looked like what would happen if a medieval alchemist and a modern chemist had a baby and raised it on a diet of weird books and questionable life choices. There were mortars and pestles of every size, scales precise enough to measure a grain of salt, and distillation equipment that would make a moonshiner jealous. The lighting was provided by a combination of candles and oil lamps, creating a warm, flickering glow that cast dancing shadows on the walls. This wasn't just atmospheric, it was practical. Many of the apothecary's preparations were light-sensitive, and the gentle illumination helped preserve the potency of delicate compounds. The art of not killing people. No, here's where things get really interesting. The Tudor apothecary was working without any of the scientific knowledge we take for granted today. No understanding of germs, no knowledge of chemical reactions, no concept of dosage based on body weight or medical conditions. They were essentially flying blind, guided only by centuries of accumulated knowledge, careful observation, and a healthy dose of superstition. And yet, somehow, they managed to help people. The secret was in their approach to the work. Unlike physicians, who often prescribed dramatic treatments like bloodletting or purging, apothecaries focused on gentle, supportive care. They used herbs to reduce fever, ease pain, and help the body heal itself. It wasn't always effective, but it was usually harmless, which in Tudor medicine was actually a pretty high bar. The apothecary's knowledge came from several sources. First, there were the classical texts, works by ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Galen and Dioscorides, translated and retranslated through Arabic and Latin. These books were treasured possessions, often hand-copied, and passed down through generations of practitioners. Second, there was folk knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of trial and error, passed down through apprenticeships and community networks. This knowledge was often remarkably accurate. For example, willow bark was commonly used to treat pain and fever, and we now know it contains salicin, a compound related to aspirin. The Materia Medica, a catalogue of curiosities. Tudor apothecary's arsenal was divided into three main categories: vegetable, mineral, and animal. The vegetable kingdom provided the bulk of the medicine's herbs, roots, leaves, flowers, and seeds that could be prepared in dozens of different ways. The mineral kingdom contributed metals, salts, and stones that were believed to have healing properties. And the animal kingdom, well, that's where things got weird. Let's start with the vegetable preparations, which were the bread and butter of the trade. The apothecary would work with herbs in every conceivable form. Fresh herbs were gathered at specific times of day and seasons of the year, when their supposed potency was at its peak. They would be dried, ground, distilled, fermented, and combined in complex preparations that required precise timing and technique. The process of making a simple herbal tincture illustrates the complexity of the work. First, the herbs had to be harvested at the right time, often at dawn, when the dew was still on the leaves, or during specific phases of the moon. The herbs were then cleaned, dried, and prepared according to recipes that had been refined over generations. The extraction process involved soaking the herbs in alcohol or wine for weeks or months, periodically straining and re-soaking to extract every bit of active compound. The resulting tincture was then aged, filtered, and tested for potency. The entire process could take months, and the apothecary might have dozens of different preparations aging simultaneously. The night shift advantage. We did apothecaries do their best work at night? Several reasons, actually. First, many of their preparations were time-sensitive. Distillation, for example, required constant attention and precise temperature control. Working at night allowed them to focus without interruption from customers, suppliers, or curious neighbors. Second, some ingredients were believed to be more potent when prepared at night. This wasn't entirely superstition. Many plants do produce different concentrations of active compounds at different times of day. Working by candlelight also helped preserve light-sensitive compounds that could be degraded by sunlight. Third, the night shift allowed apothecaries to handle their more controversial preparations. Some of the ingredients in the Tudor pharmacy would have raised eyebrows even in that liberal age. Human body parts, for example, were commonly used in medicines. Mummy powder, ground up Egyptian mummies, was considered a cure-all, and human blood was thought to be especially effective for treating epilepsy. The customers of the night. The apothecary's night shift wasn't just about preparation, it was also about service. Sick people don't keep regular business hours, and the apothecary was often the only medical help available after dark. Servants would pound on the shop door at midnight, begging for medicine for their sick masters. Worried mothers would arrive with feverish children, desperate for anything that might help. These midnight consultations were often the most challenging part of the job. The apothecary had to diagnose conditions based on descriptions from panicked relatives, often with limited information and no way to examine the patient directly. They had to balance the desire to help with the risk of making things worse. The consultation process was part medical examination, part psychological counseling, and part negotiation. The apothecary would listen to the symptoms, ask about the patient's lifestyle and medical history, and then recommend a course of treatment. But the treatment had to be something the customer could afford and was willing to try. The economics of healing. Tudor Apothecary operated in a complex economic environment. Unlike modern pharmacies, which fill prescriptions written by doctors, apothecaries were both the prescriber and the dispenser. They diagnosed conditions, recommended treatments, and provided the medicines, all for a single fee. This created interesting incentives. On one hand, apothecaries had a financial interest in keeping their customers healthy and satisfied. Repeat business was crucial, and a reputation for effective treatment was worth more than gold. On the other hand, they needed to make a living, which meant finding the right balance between effectiveness and profitability. The most expensive ingredients were often the most exotic. Imported spices, rare minerals, and unusual animal parts commanded premium prices, but these weren't necessarily the most effective treatments. The apothecary had to navigate between what customers expected, expensive, exotic remedies, and what actually worked, often simple, local preparations. The regulation challenge. The Tudor apothecary operated in a regulatory environment that was both strict and chaotic. The Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, founded in 1617, attempted to regulate the trade, but enforcement was spotty at best. Anyone could set up shop as an apothecary, regardless of training or competence. This led to a Wild West atmosphere where legitimate practitioners competed with charlatans and quacks. The good apothecaries built their reputations on careful preparation, honest dealing, and effective treatments. The bad ones relied on flashy marketing, exotic ingredients, and the hope that their customers would recover naturally. The regulatory challenge was compounded by the overlap between different medical professions. Physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries all treated similar conditions, but with different approaches and different legal authorities. Turf wars were common, and customers often played one profession against another to get the best treatment. The plague year's most challenging time for Tudor apothecaries was during plague outbreaks, which occurred regularly throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. During these epidemics, the apothecary's shop became a combination of pharmacy, morgue, and fortress. The demand for medicine was enormous, but the supply of ingredients was often disrupted by quarantines and trade restrictions. Apothecaries developed specialized plague remedies, many of which were actually quite effective. They used aromatic herbs like rosemary and thyme, which we now know have antimicrobial properties. They recommended quarantine measures that helped slow the spread of disease, and they provided psychological support to terrified communities. The plague years also saw the rise of the plague doctor, a specialized medical practitioner who wore a distinctive costume with a long beak filled with aromatic herbs. While these doctors were often physicians, they relied heavily on apothecary-prepared medicines and treatments. The gender dynamics. One of the most interesting aspects of Tudor apothecary work was the role of women. While women were generally excluded from the medical professions, they played a crucial role in the apothecary trade. Many apothecary shops were family businesses, with wives and daughters working alongside their husbands and fathers. Women often specialized in the preparation of medicines for women's conditions, pregnancy, childbirth, and gynecological issues. They developed extensive knowledge of herbs and treatments that were passed down through generations of women practitioners. Some women operated their own apothecary shops, often inheriting the business from deceased husbands. These women entrepreneurs faced significant challenges, including legal restrictions and social prejudice, but many were successful and respected in their communities. The tools of the Tudor apothecary's toolkit was a fascinating collection of specialized equipment, each piece designed for specific tasks. The mortar and pestle were essential for grinding herbs and minerals into powder. Different sizes were used for different purposes, large ones for coarse grinding, small ones for fine powders. Scales were crucial for measuring ingredients precisely. The apothecary's scales were often works of art in themselves, with brass pans and weights that were calibrated to exacting standards. A small error in measurement could mean the difference between a helpful medicine and a harmful poison. Distillation equipment allowed the apothecary to extract essential oils and other concentrated compounds from plants. The process was complex and time-consuming, requiring careful control of temperature and timing. The resulting oils and waters were often the most potent medicines in the shop. The transformation of night. As our Tudor apothecary worked through the night, he was participating in a transformation that was happening across society. The night was becoming more than just a time for rest. It was becoming a time for specialized work that required focus, precision, and uninterrupted attention. The apothecary's night shift was part of a larger pattern of professional specialization that was emerging in Tudor society. Just as the medieval baker had claimed the pre-dawn hours for bread-making, the apothecary was claiming the night hours for medicine-making. This specialization allowed for higher quality products and more professional service. The night shift also created a sense of mystery and authority around the apothecary's work. There was something almost magical about the idea of medicines being prepared in the darkness, with careful rituals and secret knowledge. This mystique helped establish the apothecary as a professional authority, distinct from folk healers and charlatans. The legacy of night healing. Tudor apothecary's night shift established patterns that persist in modern medicine. The idea that medical care should be available around the clock, the importance of precise preparation and measurement, and the combination of scientific knowledge with compassionate care. All of these concepts trace back to those candlelit workshops. These apothecaries were the bridge between ancient folk medicine and modern pharmacy. They preserved and transmitted centuries of medical knowledge while gradually developing more scientific approaches to healing. They served their communities with dedication and skill, often at great personal risk, and they did it all in the darkness, working by candlelight to prepare medicines that might mean the difference between life and death for their neighbors. They were the night shift of healing, the guardians of health who worked while others slept. Up the next time you pick up a prescription at your local pharmacy, remember our Tudor apothecary. Remember that the tradition of precise, careful medicine preparation has deep roots in the night shift work of centuries past. And maybe, just maybe, you'll have a little more appreciation for the complex history behind that simple bottle of pills. Chapter 3. The Colonial Tavern Keeper's Watch. The heartbeat of revolution. Let's cross the Atlantic and jump forward to colonial America, around 1770. The air is thick with more than just tobacco smoke. It's electric with revolutionary tension. And at the center of it all, staying up late into the night, is one of history's most underappreciated figures, the colonial tavern keeper. Meet Samuel Hartwell, proprietor of the Red Lion Tavern in a small Massachusetts town. It's 2 a.m., and while most respectable citizens are asleep, Sam's establishment is still buzzing with quiet activity. The main dining room has been cleared of its dinner crowd, but the private back rooms are occupied by men speaking in hushed tones about taxes, representation, and something they're calling liberty. Sam isn't just serving drinks, he's facilitating the birth of a nation. The colonial tavern keeper was part bartender, part innkeeper, part banker, part news anchor, and part revolutionary co-conspirator. They were the nerve centers of colonial life, the places where information flowed like ale and decisions were made that would echo through history. The architecture of rebellion. The colonial tavern was designed for discretion and multiple functions. The main floor featured a large common room with a massive fireplace, long tables, and benches that could accommodate travelers, locals, and anyone else who needed a warm meal and a place to gather. But the real action happened in the smaller, private rooms upstairs, And in the back, these private rooms were where the serious business took place. They were deliberately designed to be soundproof, with thick walls and heavy doors that could keep conversations private. The rooms were furnished with smaller tables, more comfortable chairs, and good lighting, perfect for reading documents, writing letters, and planning activities that the British authorities probably wouldn't approve of. The tavern keeper controlled access to these rooms, deciding who could use them and when. This wasn't just about collecting rent, it was about managing information flow and maintaining the delicate balance between revolutionary activity and plausible deniability. A good tavern keeper knew how to see nothing, hear nothing, and remember nothing when the authorities came asking questions. The information network colonial tavern served as the internet of the 18th century. In a world without mass media, telephones, or rapid transportation, taverns were where news was shared, rumors were spread, and public opinion was formed. The tavern keeper was like a combination of Google, Facebook, and CNN all rolled into one person. The information network worked through travelers, who would arrive with news from other towns, other colonies, and sometimes even from Europe. Tavern keeper would collect this information, verify it when possible, and then share it with local customers. The most reliable tavern keepers became trusted sources of news, while those who spread false information quickly lost credibility. But the information didn't just flow in one direction. Local news, gossip, and opinions would be shared with travelers, who would carry them to other destinations. A single piece of information could travel from Massachusetts to Georgia in a matter of weeks, passed from tavern to tavern like a revolutionary game of telephone. The tavern keeper had to be skilled at managing this information flow. They needed to know who could be trusted with sensitive information, who might be British sympathizers, and who was likely to spread rumors or cause trouble. It was a delicate balance that required good judgment, excellent memory, and the ability to read people quickly and accurately. The economics of revolution running a colonial tavern was a complex business that went far beyond just serving food and drinks. The tavern keeper was essentially operating a hotel, restaurant, bank, post office, and meeting hall all at the same time. And during the revolutionary period, they were doing it in an increasingly unstable economic environment. The tavern's income came from multiple sources. Room rentals provided steady revenue from travelers who needed a place to stay. Meals brought in money from both guests and locals who didn't want to cook at home. Drinks, particularly rum, which was cheap and plentiful, provided high margin income that kept the business profitable. But the tavern keeper also served as an informal banker. In a cash-poor economy, they would extend credit to regular customers, accept payment in goods rather than money, and sometimes serve as a go-between for larger financial transactions. They might hold money for travelers, arrange loans between community members, or even serve as a primitive insurance company. The revolutionary period added new complications to the business model. British taxes and trade restrictions made imported goods more expensive and sometimes unavailable. Continental currency was unreliable and often worthless, and the constant threat of conflict made long-term planning nearly impossible. The night shift economy. Tavern keeper's night shift was when the most profitable business often took place, while the daytime crowd consisted mostly of travelers and locals grabbing quick meals. The evening and night hours attracted customers who were willing to pay premium prices for privacy, discretion, and specialized services. Wealthy merchants and planters would rent private rooms for important business meetings. Lawyers would use the quiet evening hours to meet with clients and prepare cases. And increasingly, groups of men would gather to discuss political topics that were best kept away from British ears. The tavern keeper charged premium rates for these evening services: private room rental, late-night meals, and extended drinking sessions all commanded higher prices than daytime service. The night shift often generated more profit per hour than the busy daytime period. The revolutionary meetings as tensions with Britain increased, colonial taverns became the unofficial headquarters of the resistance movement. The tavern keeper found themselves at the center of revolutionary planning, often without actively choosing to be involved. Their establishment was simply the natural place for like-minded colonists to gather and discuss their grievances. These meetings had to be carefully managed. The tavern keeper needed to provide a secure environment where sensitive topics could be discussed without fear of British surveillance. They had to balance the need for secrecy with the business requirement of serving food and drinks to paying customers. The meetings themselves were often informal affairs. A group of men would gather for what appeared to be a social evening. But the conversation would gradually turn to politics. Plans would be discussed, letters would be read, and decisions would be made that would affect the entire community. The tavern keeper's role was crucial but subtle. They would ensure that the right people were in the right rooms at the right times. They would provide information about who was in town, what news had arrived, and what the mood was among different groups. They would serve as a go-between for different factions and help coordinate activities across multiple communities. The committees of correspondencian of the most important revolutionary organizations to emerge from the tavern network was the committees of correspondence. These were informal groups of colonists who coordinated communication between different towns and colonies, sharing information about British activities and colonial responses. The tavern keeper often served as a key node in this network. They would receive letters from other communities, share them with local committee members, and help draft responses. The tavern's private rooms provided secure meeting spaces for committee activities, and the tavern keeper's knowledge of local people and politics made them valuable advisors. The committees were remarkably effective at coordinating colonial resistance. When the British imposed new taxes or restrictions, word would spread through the tavern network within days. Coordinated responses could be organized quickly, and public opinion could be mobilized across multiple colonies simultaneously. The Sons of Liberty, one of the most famous revolutionary organizations, relied heavily on taverns for their activity as these groups of colonial activists organized boycotts, protests, and sometimes more direct action against British policies, and they did much of their planning in the back rooms of sympathetic taverns. The tavern keeper's relationship with the Sons of Liberty was complicated. On one hand, these men were good customers who paid well for private meeting spaces and consumed significant amounts of food and drink. On the other hand, their activities were increasingly illegal and could bring unwanted attention from British authorities. A smart tavern keeper would maintain plausible deniability while providing necessary support. They might happen to be busy in the kitchen when certain conversations were taking place. They might forget to mention certain meetings when questioned by authorities, and they might accidentally leave certain doors unlocked or provide certain customers with keys to private entrances. The Sons of Liberty meetings were theatrical affairs, designed to build solidarity and commitment among members. They would often include ritualistic elements, special toasts, ceremonial objects, and formal declarations of loyalty to the cause. The tavern keeper would facilitate these rituals by providing appropriate settings, special drinks, and symbolic objects. The intelligence network. As the conflict with Britain intensified, colonial taverns became crucial nodes in an intelligence network that would make the CIA proud. The tavern keeper was perfectly positioned to gather information about British troop movements, government policies, and loyalist activities. The intelligence gathering was often subtle and indirect. A British officer might let slip information about upcoming operations while drinking with friends. A government official's servant might share gossip about their master's activities. A loyalist merchant might reveal details about trade restrictions or tax collection procedures. The tavern keeper would collect this information and pass it along to the appropriate revolutionary contacts. They developed coded language and secret signals to communicate sensitive information without arousing suspicion. A particular drink order might indicate that important news was available. The placement of certain objects might signal that a meeting was needed. The most successful tavern keepers developed extensive networks of informants and contacts. They would cultivate relationships with servants, clerks, and other people who had access to sensitive information. They would trade favors, extend credit, and provide other incentives to keep the information flowing. The female network, and of the most overlooked aspects of colonial tavern intelligence, was the role of women. The tavern keeper's wife, daughters, and female servants were often the most effective intelligence gatherers, precisely because they were underestimated by British officials and loyalist men. Women could move freely in social situations where men might be suspect. They could engage in seemingly innocent conversations that revealed important information. They could observe and remember details that men might miss or ignore. And they could communicate with other women through networks that were largely invisible to male authorities. The tavern keeper's wife often served as the unofficial coordinator of this female intelligence network. She would host tea parties and social gatherings that were actually information-sharing sessions. She would coordinate with other tavern keepers' wives to ensure that important news was distributed quickly and accurately. These women also played crucial roles in the economic aspects of the resistance. They organized boycotts of British goods, coordinated the production of homemade alternatives, and managed the complex logistics of supporting families whose breadwinners were involved in dangerous revolutionary activities. The Midnight Ridders Tavern network was essential to the success of famous revolutionary activities like Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. But Revere wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger network of riders and messengers who relied on taverns for horses, information, and safe haven. The system worked like this. When important news needed to be spread quickly, messengers would ride from tavern to tavern, changing horses and gathering additional information at each stop. The tavern keeper would provide fresh horses, current local news, and directions to the next safe stop. The Midnight Ride network required careful preparation and coordination. Tavern keepers had to maintain relationships with reliable messengers, keep fresh horses available, and stay informed about local conditions that might affect travel. They had to know which roads were safe, which bridges might be washed, and which local officials could be trusted. The most famous Midnight Ride was just one of many such operations. The tavern network facilitated hundreds of similar missions, carrying news of British activities, coordinating colonial responses, and maintaining communication between revolutionary leaders across the colonies. The Boston Tea Party connection. The Boston Tea Party, one of the most famous acts of colonial resistance, was planned and coordinated through the tavern network. The meetings that led to the Tea Party took place in Boston taverns, and the participants used tavern backrooms to plan their operation and coordinate their disguises. The tavern keepers involved in the Tea Party planning had to balance secrecy with logistics. They needed to provide meeting spaces for the planners while maintaining plausible deniability about the meeting's purposes. They had to facilitate communication between different groups of participants while avoiding British surveillance. On the night of the Tea Party itself, several taverns served as staging areas where participants changed into their Native American disguises and received final instructions. After the operation, taverns provided safe spaces where participants could change back into normal clothes and establish alibis for their whereabouts. The success of the Boston Tea Party demonstrated the effectiveness of the tavern networking coordinating complex operations across multiple groups and locations. It showed how the seemingly innocent business of serving food and drinks could mask sophisticated revolutionary activity. Economic warfare. Colonial taverns also played crucial roles in the economic warfare that preceded the military conflict. They served as coordination points for boycotts of British goods, helping to organize and maintain the non-importation agreements that put economic pressure on Britain. The tavern keeper would help coordinate local boycott activities, ensuring that participating merchants had alternative sources for necessary goods, and that customers knew which businesses were supporting the boycott. They would provide meeting spaces for merchant committees and help resolve disputes about boycott compliance. The taverns also served as distribution points for locally produced alternatives to British goods. When colonists stopped importing British tea, taverns would serve Liberty tea made from local herbs. When cloth imports were restricted, taverns might display and sell locally woven textiles. The Cultural Revolution. Beyond the political and economic aspects, colonial taverns were centers of a cultural revolution that was reshaping American identity. The conversations, debates, and social interactions that took place in these establishments were creating new ideas about citizenship, democracy, and individual rights. The tavern keeper facilitated these cultural changes by providing spaces where people from different social classes, occupations, and backgrounds could interact as equals. The egalitarian atmosphere of the tavern challenged traditional hierarchies and created new forms of social organization based on merit and shared beliefs rather than birth or wealth. The debates that took place in colonial taverns were essentially workshops in democratic theory. Colonists were learning how to discuss complex political issues, build consensus, and make collective decisions. They were developing the skills and attitudes that would be essential for self-government. The Loyalist challenge. Not all colonial taverns supported the revolutionary cause. Some tavern keepers remained loyal to Britain, either from genuine conviction or from economic necessity. This created a complex and sometimes dangerous situation where competing taverns represented different political factions. Loyalist tavern keepers faced particular challenges during the Revolutionary period. They had to serve customers who increasingly opposed British rule while maintaining their own political beliefs. They had to navigate between their personal convictions and their business interests. The competition between patriot and loyalist taverns sometimes became intense. Customers would boycott establishments owned by political opponents. Rival taverns would spread rumors about each other's activities. In some cases, the competition escalated to vandalism or physical confrontation. Revolutionary tavern keepers had to be particularly careful about loyalist infiltration. British sympathizers might attempt to gather intelligence about revolutionary activities or disrupt important meetings. The tavern keeper had to develop methods for identifying and excluding potential spies while avoiding alienating legitimate customers. The transformation of authoritative colonial tavern keepers' night shift was part of a larger transformation in how authority functioned in American society. Traditional sources of authority, royal governors, appointed officials, established churches, were being challenged by new forms of democratic leadership that emerged from grassroots organizations. The tavern keeper became a new type of community leader, one whose authority was based on service, knowledge, and the ability to facilitate collective action rather than on hereditary status or official appointment. They demonstrated that leadership could emerge from commercial activity and voluntary association rather than from formal political structures. This transformation of authority was evident in how revolutionary activities were organized and coordinated. Instead of following orders from established leaders, colonists were learning to work together as equals, making collective decisions and sharing responsibility for their implementation. The logistics of revolution, practical aspects of organizing. A revolution required enormous logistical coordination, and colonial taverns served as crucial logistical hubs. They provided storage for supplies, meeting spaces for planning, and communication centers for coordinating activities across wide geographic areas. The tavern keeper had to manage these logistical challenges while maintaining normal business operations. They might need to hide weapons in their cellars, store documents in secret compartments, or provide safe houses for people fleeing British authorities. All of this had to be done while serving meals to regular customers and maintaining the appearance of a normal business. The logistical requirements increased dramatically as the conflict approached. More meetings needed secure spaces. More messages needed reliable delivery. More supplies needed secure storage. The tavern keeper had to expand their operations and develop new capabilities while avoiding detection by increasingly suspicious authorities. The dawn of independence as our colonial tavern keeper worked through those crucial nights in the 1770s. They were witnessing and facilitating the birth of a new nation. The conversations in their back rooms, the letters passed through their network, and the plans made around their tables were creating the foundation for American independence. The night shift work of colonial tavern keepers established patterns that would influence American political culture for generations. The tradition of grassroots political organization, the importance of free speech and assembly, and the role of commercial establishments as community centers all trace back to those revolutionary days. RNS. The tavern keeper's combination of business, acumen, and political commitment created a model for civic engagement that emphasized practical action over theoretical purity. They showed how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary contributions to historical change through dedication, skill, and willingness to take calculated risks. The legacy of the revolutionary night shift, colonial tavern keeper's night shift, represents one of the most crucial periods in American history. These individuals, working in the darkness while their communities slept, helped create the conditions that made American independence possible. They demonstrated that revolution could be organized through existing social and economic networks, rather than requiring entirely new institutions. The success of the American Revolution owed much to the tavern network that facilitated communication, coordination, and planning across the colonies. The tavern keeper's night shift work created the infrastructure that allowed a scattered collection of colonial communities to act as a unified resistance movement. Their legacy extends far beyond the Revolutionary period. The American tradition of citizen participation in politics, the importance of local organizing, and the role of commercial establishments as community gathering places all reflect the influence of colonial tavern culture. So the next time you're in a local bar or restaurant, and you overhear people discussing politics, remember our colonial tavern keeper. Remember that some of the most important conversations in American history took place in similar establishments, facilitated by people who understood that democracy requires spaces where citizens can gather, debate, and organize for change. The night shift has always been about more than just work. It's been about keeping the essential functions of civilization running while others sleep. And sometimes, as in the case of our colonial tavern keepers, that work includes nothing less than the creation of nations and the advancement of human freedom. Conclusion. The eternal night shift common thread. As we reach the end of our journey through history's night shift, let's take a moment to reflect on what connects these three very different workers across centuries and continents. Our medieval baker, Tudor apothecary, and colonial tavern keeper shared more than just irregular sleep schedules. They were all essential links in the chain that kept civilization functioning. Each of these individuals made a conscious choice to sacrifice their own comfort and convenience for the benefit of their communities. They worked in darkness so others could live in light, They stayed awake so others could sleep peacefully. They took on the difficult, dangerous, and often thankless work that society needed but rarely acknowledged. But there's something else. They shared a deep understanding that their work was about more than just earning a living. The baker wasn't just making bread, he was sustaining life itself. The apothecary wasn't just mixing medicines, he was fighting against suffering and death. The tavern keeper wasn't just serving drinks, he was facilitating the conversations and connections that held communities together. The innovation of necessity, one of the most striking aspects of these historical night shift workers, was their incredible capacity for innovation. Working without modern conveniences, they developed sophisticated techniques and systems that often surpassed what we might expect from their time periods. The medieval baker's mastery of fermentation, temperature control, and timing rivaled that of modern artisan bakers. The Tudor apothecary's understanding of herb preparation and patient care incorporated principles that are still valid today. The colonial tavern keeper's management of information networks and coordination of complex activities demonstrated organizational skills that would impress modern business consultants. This innovation was born of necessity. Without electric lights, precise instruments, or instant communication, they had to develop alternative methods that were often more sophisticated than the obvious approaches. They couldn't rely on technology to solve their problems, so they had to develop deeper understanding of the fundamental principles underlying their work. The social contract. Each of these night shift workers operated under an implicit social contract with their communities. They provided essential services in exchange for economic support and social respect. But the contract went deeper than simple commerce. It involved mutual obligation and shared responsibility for community welfare. The community depended on these workers to maintain essential services regardless of personal hardship or external circumstances. During plagues, famines, wars, and other crises, the night shift workers were expected to continue their duties even when it meant significant personal risk. In return, the community provided not just economic support, but also social protection and recognition. The guild system protected bakers from unfair competition. Professional organizations defended apothecaries against accusations of malpractice, and local communities supported tavern keepers who faced political persecution for their activities. The price of essential work. Night shift has always come with costs that extend far beyond the obvious inconvenience of working unusual hours. Our historical workers faced physical dangers, social isolation, and psychological pressures that were rarely acknowledged or compensated. The medieval baker risked fire injury and chronic health problems from constant exposure to heat and smoke. The Tudor apothecary faced potential poisoning from handling dangerous substances and social persecution if treatments failed. The colonial tavern keeper risked imprisonment, property confiscation, and even execution for supporting revolutionary activities. But perhaps the greatest cost was the social isolation that came with night shift work. While their neighbors were socializing, celebrating, and building relationships during evening hours, our night shift workers were laboring alone or with small groups of fellow workers. They sacrificed normal family life and community participation for the demands of their essential work. The dignity of service. Despite these costs, our historical night shift workers found dignity and meaning in their service to others. They understood that their work was essential to the functioning of their communities, and they took pride in performing it well despite difficult circumstances. This dignity wasn't just personal satisfaction, it was recognized and respected by their communities. The medieval baker was seen as a pillar of the community. The Tudor apothecary was regarded as a learned professional deserving of respect and consultation. The colonial tavern keeper was acknowledged as a community leader whose establishment served vital social functions. The dignity of their service was enhanced by the skill and knowledge required for their work. These weren't simple jobs that anyone could perform. They required years of training, accumulated experience, and ongoing learning. The night shift workers were craftsmen and professionals who had mastered complex skills and specialized knowledge. The modern echo as we look at our three historical examples. It's impossible not to see parallels with modern night shift workers. Today's emergency room nurses, overnight security guards, 24-hour restaurant staff, and third-shift factory workers are continuing a tradition that stretches back centuries. The essential nature of night shift work hasn't changed. Our modern civilization still depends on people who are willing to work while others sleep. The hospitals, power plants, emergency services, and communication networks that keep our world running all require dedicated night shift workers. The challenges haven't changed much either. Modern night shift workers still face health risks from disrupted sleep patterns, social isolation from working opposite schedules from family and friends, and the psychological stress of working in a world designed for daytime schedules. But the dignity and importance of the work remain unchanged. As well, the nurse who monitors patients through the night, the dispatcher who coordinates emergency responses, and the maintenance worker who keeps essential systems running are all modern descendants of Army, Diego Baker, Tudor apothecary, and colonial tavern keeper. The lesson for today: what can we learn from these historical night shift workers? First, that essential work often requires personal sacrifice. But that sacrifice can be meaningful and dignified when it serves the greater good. Second, that innovation and excellence can emerge from the most challenging circumstances when people are committed to their work and their communities. Third, that the night shift has always been about more than just the specific tasks being performed. It's about maintaining the continuous operation of civilization itself. The night shift workers are the guardians who ensure that the essential functions of society continue even when the rest of us aren't paying attention. Finally, we can learn that the night shift creates a unique perspective on life and society, working when others sleep, seeing the world at its most vulnerable and quiet hours, and taking responsibility for essential functions that others take for granted. All of this creates insights and understanding that can't be gained any other way. The continuing story of the night shift continues today and will continue tomorrow. As long as human civilization requires continuous operation, and it always will, there will be people willing to work through the night to keep essential functions running. The technologies will change, the specific jobs will evolve, but that fundamental dynamic will remain the same. Some people will sacrifice their own comfort and convenience to serve others. They will work in darkness so others can live in light. They will stay awake so others can sleep peacefully. And they will continue the tradition established by our medieval baker, Tudor apothecary, and colonial tavern keeper, the tradition of finding dignity, meaning, and purpose in essential work that others depend on but rarely see. A final thought: so tonight, as you're getting ready for bed, take a moment to think about the people who will be working while you sleep. The nurses in the hospital, the police officers on patrol, the factory workers keeping production lines running, the truck drivers delivering goods across the country. All of them are continuing a tradition that stretches back centuries. They're the modern descendants of history's night shift workers, and they're performing the same essential function, keeping civilization running while the rest of us rest. They deserve our recognition, our respect, and our gratitude, because the night shift has always been about more than just work. It's been about service, dedication, and the understanding that some things are too important to stop just because the sun has gone down. The night shift workers are the guardians of continuity, the keepers of the essential flame that must never be allowed to go out. And in their quiet dedication to difficult work, they embody some of the best qualities of human civilization: the willingness to serve others, the commitment to excellence even in challenging circumstances, and the understanding that individual sacrifice can serve the greater good. The night shift continues, as it always has and always will, and we are all better for it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the night shift of history. I hope these stories have given you a new appreciation for the essential work that has always taken place while the rest of the world sleeps. Sweet dreams. And remember, someone is always watching over the night.